Thank you all very much. We have the blessing of being able to talk with you after you've had a wonderful lunch. So we know we're competing with some digestion, but we'll do our best. I just want to introduce and give you a little roadmap for how we're going to spend our time just briefly before I pass it off to Jess. We're going to begin with Jess talking to us a little bit about a couple of examples anyway of cultural obstacles to a culture of mercy and presence. And then I'll be talking about our need to cultivate our capacity for mercy and presence. Then the two of us will give a few practical examples about practicing mercy and presence, both personally and professionally. And then we'd really like to hear your insights, comments, and questions. One of the great benefits of a conference like this is the variety of perspectives that we all represent. So we're really eager to hear your voices as well in this conversation, formally, but then also in the hallway after we finish. So I'm going to pass it over to Jess to start us off.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay. So some of what I'm going to talk about has been prefigured in our morning's talks. Peter Maurin was a French philosopher, a peasant who co-founded the Catholic Worker, and I promise I had this in here before I heard John Cavadini reference him last night. He co-founded the Catholic Worker with Dorothy Day. In one of his easy essays, he wrote, "We want to create a new society in the shell of the old, a society where it is easier to be good." He also believed that the church possessed within her rich storehouse of treasures the answers to human beings' deepest longings. And he enjoined church leaders and regular folk alike to blow the dynamite of the church. And this dynamite, he knew and we know, is the Eucharistic presence of God's mercy. Maurin also knew that creating a society where it is easier to be good required a sober examination of the systems of hideaways we create that make it harder to be present, truthful, and merciful. So as we embark on this complex journey this afternoon of thinking about what it might mean to cultivate mercy and presence, we'll begin by reflecting on two contemporary forms of presence and absence that I think shape the way we imagine intimacy and mercy. I'd like to suggest that a sober examination of our cultural practices of bodily presence and absence is essential if we are to envision a new society in the shell of the old. We will invite you to consider with us how we might create interior and exterior spaces, cultures, formed in the intricate pattern of Eucharistic presence and mercy. So if you watched this past Sunday's Oscars, you will know that Pixar's Coco won for Best Animated Film. And the film delves into the mystery of life and death and life after death. It shows that how we approach life, how we approach death, shapes how we live. Whether and how we remember the dead and death matters. This is particularly relevant, I think, in some of the social mapping of presence and mercy that we'll be doing. In our last session, Father Gilger mentioned that the American brand of individualism forgets its ancestors and its descendants. And I think this is nowhere more evident than the disappearance of the dead from their own funerals. I know it seems like we might be starting a little far afield from youth and youth ministry, but I promise we're not actually that far. So there's been a broad shift of death and dying away from the home and to the institution. And there are good reasons for this, but it has resulted in the marginalization of death and dying, of suffering, to the peripheries of society. So take a moment and think about the last person you personally knew who died. What did they mean to you? Did you attend the funeral? What about the wake? Was there a body? Thomas Lynch, who we see pictured here, a poet, essayist, and undertaker from the small town of Milford, Michigan, has observed that in the last few generations, the presence of the dead at their own funerals has become optional. We were a people who sat with our dying, both of us, the one sitting vigil and the one nearing death, stripped to the barest of bareness, of simply being. We were a people who bore the weight of our dead, ushering them from the home to the church to the cemetery. And too often, we hide from dying. I know I've done this, with saying things like, I just can't handle it. I wouldn't know what to say, or I wouldn't know what to do. And yet, it is precisely in this being with the dying and bearing the weight of the dead that we process through grief and loss, these bodily practices. This movement from waking and sitting vigil, of the funeral rite, of the burial, are all important movements of the bodies of the living and the dead. Thomas Lynch, in his book, The Good Funeral, has said, our society has forgotten what to do with the dead and persuaded itself that this amnesia is a sign of health and freedom. But the truth is that a people who cannot care for the dead and accompany them to a place of farewell are a people with a diminished ability to care for the living and to join with others in communities of trust and meaning. The ways we are present to our dead affect how we are present to the living. Our practices, I would like to suggest, at life's end are not an isolated set of phenomena, but ought to alert us to a broader shift in our view of what it means to be present, about what it means to be merciful, and ultimately about what it means to be human. If we don't want to see the dead, what else will we not want to see? In the particularity of dealing with the mortal flesh of our dead, we are dealing with the thing itself, with death, mortality, yes, with hope in the resurrection. Burying the dead is, after all, a work of mercy, a work that cannot be done except in the doing. So the absence of the dead from their own funerals allows us, the living, to hide from that risk of mercy, to avoid that bearing of weight, the weight of love that makes presence possible. And that's the thing about all of the works of mercy, spiritual and corporal. They are done in the doing. They are done in the doing. We cannot, for example, pray for the living and the dead by thinking about praying for the living and the dead. If I prayed as often as I thought about praying, I would be a much holier person. We cannot pray without actually doing the thing. So it is in the work, in those gestures of love and the words of tenderness, that mercy is done. After all, St. James asks, what good is it if a brother or sister has nothing to wear and has no food for the day, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, and be well fed, but does not give them the necessities of the body? I'm struck that St. James is addressing a community, he says, and one of you says, because we are a community of people called to enact mercy. The mercy we have received. And mercy requires those gestures of presence and care that embody the gift of the mercy we have received in the Eucharist, which is nothing other than God's mercy present in the simplest and most impoverished of forms, the presence of the God of mercy in the body and blood of Jesus Christ. So we're going to pivot now slightly. I hope I've convinced you that the presence of the dead is very important at funerals. And this second sphere of presence is not going to seem, I think, immediately connected, but I think it has something to tell us about presence and absence in a different sphere of life. If our habits and practices at life's end show us the importance of the body being present for the works of mercy, then I think this next practice allows us to reflect on the centrality of mercy for authentic presence. We, on the one hand, hide from death by hiding the bodies of the dead. In this next example, in pornography, there's an overexposure of the body, curated and stylized, that allows us to hide from intimacy. Because in pornography, the body is exposed as an object of consumption in such a way that humanity is systematically hidden precisely in this overexposure. And it's hard for, I think, anyone to talk about it. It's one of the least talked about and most powerful technological forces shaping young people's capacities for intimacy and commitment. Globally, pornography is a $97 billion a year industry, which is more than Major League Baseball, the NFL, and the NBA combined. It produces 12% of all online content. This is one major pornography website, has 80 million visitors a day. That's just one. That's 92 billion a year. 93% of college male students and 62% of female students said they saw online pornography before the age of 18. In 2016, a study conducted in Great Britain of 1,011 to 16-year-olds found that 53% of boys and 39% of girls reported that pornography was realistic. I should also note that Great Britain has just announced plans to block online pornography. 64% of young people, that's ages 13 to 24, actively seek out pornography each week. The average child is first exposed to online pornography at age 11, often by accident, and 40 million Americans regularly view pornography. This goes across social class, across racial demographics, across education. Sherry Turkle, an MIT psychologist who studies the way Americans use technology and how it impacts daily life, has observed that it doesn't just change what we do, it changes who we are. And if what we do and who we are if what we do and how we do it forms who we are, then it shouldn't be too surprising to find that the form and content together, that marriage of online pornography, isn't just shaping what young people do. It is shaping how they imagine presence. At a very basic level, it is changing the way that they establish and form relationships. And so we might note a difference here between the established married couple in which online pornography or pornography of any type comes into the marriage, how disruptive that is to the couple and to the family. But here we have something, I think, a bit more serious in a sense. We have online pornography forming what people think it means to be in relationship. These base conditions that establish how they will carry out relationships. So if narrative and presence are fundamental to building communities of care, as Thomas Lynch said, trust and social cohesion, societies where it is easier to be good, then I think we need to consider what type of narrative pornography tells about sex and what dispositions it cultivates. It is, make no mistake, a pedagogy. It teaches young people that presence is voluntary, is episodic, is fragmentary, and unstable is liquid, that term we heard earlier today. It teaches us that sexual intimacy is above all a transaction of pleasure. It cultivates a vision of others and ourselves as objects of consumption rather than objects of God's mercy, because it allows users to avoid that kind of intimacy that comes with sustained presence in the minutia of a life lived in a community, of making eye contact, of sharing meals, of sharing prayer. The effects of pornography are not self-contained either. They are in fact felt far beyond sort of the sphere of sexual intimacy. In many ways, the artifacts of pornography have become mainstream. It's leaked into our cultural matrix in ways that we don't often recognize. In grammar, in fashion, in married life, in family life. Just this morning on my way to work, I received a request on Instagram to follow a young woman who looked to be no more than 15, who wants to try out her sexy videos. And then a series of pictures of herself posed in various positions. So pornography is not going away. If anything, we see it escalating. People who use it are now starting to perform it, to participate in its making. We hear stories on the news about revenge porn and about sexting. This was something that happened at the school I worked at in 2009. It also shapes the way we view presence writ large. So last night, Bishop Barron talked about Pope Francis's comparison to the church as a field hospital. And if we were to further specify some of these wounds, I think that require urgent attention. I think pornography needs to be among them. It needs to be nameable, and it needs to be speakable. Not merely as a moralistic issue, but as an issue of deep formation. So the first task is naming it. Not as a moral failure, but as a culture of formation. And this first task, so a recent New York Times article suggested that, and they're right, that we need to make young adults more critical consumers of pornography. So of course we need to teach young people to be critical of the messages they're receiving, of the images that we're seeing. But critique has to be oriented towards something. It's not just enough to become a smarter, more critical consumer of porn. There has to be an end that we are moving people towards. A telos, Christ, the sacraments, an ecclesial body, an ecclesial community that performs the works of mercy together. And this needs to be taken up in our catechesis, in our ministry with young adults and youth, in marriage preparation, and in our preaching. So pornography is part of sort of a wider virtual world that we will hear more about tonight, of virtual hideouts. So Sherry Turkle, who wrote Alone Together, says that today's young people have a special vulnerability. They are always connected, yet deprived of attention. At the same time that they feel and experience pressure to constantly cultivate an online persona, a self, they also feel more and more distant and disconnected from those around them, especially adults. They are frustrated at parents and adults who are always only partially present. Turkle has noted that it's not uncommon for a scene like this for parents to be texting and emailing over a meal, for young people to occupy the same physical space and yet virtually be somewhere else. People will often text through funerals. We remove ourselves, she says, from our grief, both our grief and our reverie, into our phones. We go into our phones. This means that we can always control access to ourselves and always distance ourselves from the immediacy of presence. So I work with a student who runs a men's group here on campus, where he deals with a small group of students who they discuss issues of freedom, of desire. They've talked about pornography, prayer, masculinity. And he was leading these students through an exercise in the Basilica of seeing, of looking. And he came back after collecting some materials to find this group of 10 men spontaneously gathered in an arc around the Pieta and praying. And his first response was to do what, do you think? Take a picture. As we were talking about this, he told me, I reached into my back pocket to get out my phone, and it wasn't there. Our reflex is to capture and store. It's to capture and store so we can return to it, but not necessarily integrate it into a living narrative, our living narrative. So we are, in a way, through our phones, we're able to be present to everyone, and yet we can hide from those most intimately connected to us. So again, Sherry Turkle says that from the youngest ages, teenagers have associated technology with shared attention. Phones, before they became essential in a child's own life, were competition, one that children didn't necessarily think they could best. Today, children contend with parents who are physically close, tantalizingly so, but mentally somewhere else. Teenagers want and need adult attention. They are willing to admit they are often relieved when a parent asks them to put away their phone and sit down and talk. I think the most important thing we can do for young people is ask them to put away their phone and sit down and have a conversation with them. Young people want to be connected to the adults in their lives, but they often don't feel known, heard, or understood by them. Some of you may have seen the new A&E special about a group of 20 to 22 to 25-year-olds who go back and embed themselves in high school to report what it's like 5 years later. They weren't surprised to find that technology still reigns in high school, the presence of technology, but they were surprised by the prevalence of it. And they were also surprised by how lonely and isolated young people feel. So when we think about what it means to sit down and talk to somebody, to listen deeply, not to listen for my next comment or where I can insert myself, but to listen deeply to what they are going through, their joys, fears, and hopes. To listen in this way requires sacrifice. The sacrifice of productivity, of getting back to my programming, my lesson plans. My first year of teaching, I lesson planned all the time, and everybody hated me because I never talked to the kids. It's a sacrifice. We feel that, especially today, to linger in that space of being rather than doing. And do we value young people enough to do that, to undertake those sacrifices? So far, we've been thinking about mercy and presence sort of through their inverses, at the most existentially fraught moments of life, death and sex. On the one hand, we reflected on the phenomenon of having a funeral without a body as a particularly modern phenomenon. In our second example, we considered the way the online world impacts the quality of tangible bodily presence, how pornography thins out this understanding of presence, a bodily presence without commitment, without vulnerability, and without true intimacy because it lacks mercy. And so many aspects of our lives have become overexposed, instrumentalized, even those intimate corners. But we've also hinted at a counterculture, counter-narrative, if you will, one that Peter Maurin knew, one that we know, that the Eucharist exposes us to God's mercy. We know this from the lives of the saints, that this counter-narrative moves seamlessly within a Eucharistic rhythm. Here we have an image of St. Lucy giving alms to the poor. Notice she is at the door of the church. She is moving back and forth in this rhythm of Eucharist and mercy. She is caught up into this movement, that what we do at the altar must move out into what we do in our lives. And it's in this mercy, God's mercy, that eternal life begins even now. Thomas Merton said, the things of time are in connivance with the things of eternity. These bodies will be eternally resurrected. And it's here that we see that the Christian life is intrinsically Eucharistically oriented. It takes shape Eucharistically. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI says, the Eucharist, since it embraces the everyday, concrete existence of the believer, makes possible day by day the progressive transfiguration of all those called by grace to reflect the image of the Son of God. There is nothing authentically human. Our thoughts, our affections, our words and deeds that does not find in the sacrament of the Eucharist the form it needs to be lived to the full. Christ gave us his body, and he gives us his body again and again and again. And in him, our bodies, these things of flesh, share in the secret things of eternity.
Is that on? There we go. Speaking of bodies, how are yours? If you want to stretch a little bit for a moment as we make this transition, I'll do that with you. And take a breath. Good idea. Stand up. Remember, we have a body. I know we've been talking a lot from here up today. Feel free to move seats. Great. Hopefully that got the blood moving a little bit. If we're honest with ourselves, I think we have to admit that any lack of real presence and mercy in our culture is the result, at least in part, of our own inability to cultivate and model the presence and mercy that Jess was just referring to. So alongside our diagnosis and reimagination of the external cultures that we're talking about, which is of course really important, it's also important for us to examine, I think with the same intensity and honesty, our own interior cultures and capacities for presence and mercy. You'll recall in Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, it says the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. Except that what's genuinely human does sometimes fail to raise an echo in our hearts. Because the genuinely human doesn't always reach our hearts. Put simply, I think we struggle to cultivate a culture of mercy and presence because we struggle to draw near to the very humanity that we're trying to be present to and merciful towards. I think we're often afraid of all that's genuinely human in ourselves and in others. We don't always know what to do in the face of anger, pain, passion, death, conflict, boredom, joy. So we stay too busy to feel or acknowledge it in ourselves and others, or we self-medicate or numb in any number of ways. And this isn't surprising. We have an increasingly automated world of automated checkout lines and gas pumps and online shopping and banking and noise-canceling headphones. I remember the days when we would have to go to the bank before it closed on a Friday to get money and a lollipop. And I wanted the lollipop. Then on the weekend, if we ran out of money, because there were no ATMs in that time, or my mom wanted to, my brother would want to buy something, and she would say, I don't have the money. And he'd say, just write a check. With all this automation around us, we actually have much more opportunity to build relationship and tolerance toward temperamental technology than complex and temperamental human beings. I have a very intimate relationship with my remote. I know exactly how to throw it and then go pick it up again and work with it until it works with me. It takes practice to know and accept our own humanity and to walk without awkwardness with others in theirs. But how can we become more familiar with our human condition, which we monitor closely with Fitbits and other gadgets, but from which we're increasingly estranged? In his work, The Way of Man, the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber offers two practices that I think can help us overcome our estrangement from our own humanity and help others in our care, help them in their estrangement from their own humanity. The first practice is found in Genesis when God asks Adam, "Where art thou?" God doesn't ask Adam, "Where art thou?" because God doesn't know where Adam is. God asks Adam, "Where art thou?" because Adam doesn't know where Adam is. To escape responsibility for his life, Adam hides from himself and from God in an elaborate system of hideouts. This question, "Where art thou?" is designed to awaken Adam and draw him out of his system of hideouts. It's to show Adam to what pass he has come and to awaken him the great will to get out of it. And of course, God's question to Adam is his question to us. Where art thou? Where are you in your world? Because like Adam, we don't often know where we are. We can get lost. Those of us here, we can get lost in our titles and personas, online and off, in curated identities that obscure and hide us rather than reveal us. Like Adam, we create caves within caves within caves. And God responds with mercy within mercy within mercy. So our first practice to overcome our fear of humanity is very simple, I think, in one way, to allow the question, "Where art thou?" Where are you in your world? To penetrate our hearts. And if we manage to let this question in and allow it to draw us out from our elaborate system of hideouts, a second practice for overcoming this estrangement is to establish a quiet, devoted relationship to nearby life. Buber writes, "The highest culture of the soul remains basically arid and barren unless, day by day, waters of life pour forth into the soul from those little daily encounters to which we give their due. a quiet, devoted relationship to nearby life and performing, with holy intent, a task belonging to our daily duties, gives us more fulfillment and participation in true existence than possessing power over the ends of the earth. It's a greater thing if the streets of our native town are as bright to us as the paths of heaven. We cannot cultivate presence and mercy without maintaining holy intercourse with the little world entrusted to us. So to recap, Buber's two practices to help us overcome our estrangement from our humanity are to allow the question, "Where art thou?" to penetrate our hearts, and to establish a quiet, devoted relationship to nearby life, both of which we can take with us anywhere. Those who know me know that I've been contemplating these invitations from Buber for some time. And I find that they're difficult to exhaust, because once we've emerged from a particular hideout and established a devoted relationship to nearby life, the landscape of that nearby life changes, and I create a new kind of trendy hideout that I don't initially recognize as a hideout. And I'm invited to begin again. Of course, the definitive devoted relationship to nearby life is found in the person of Jesus Christ. As we heard in Sunday's gospel and see in this depiction of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well by Mestrovic, which is here on campus, Jesus' patient presence is the embodiment of mercy. He meets her at the well in the highest heat of the day, approaching her, though Jews don't approach and interact with Samaritans, responding to her need for well water and offering living water, asking her to claim hidden history, a history that has brought her shame and isolation, receiving her fragmented identity and returning it to her, healed and whole. She comes seeking well water in isolation, and she leaves, as you'll recall in the passage, running headlong without her water jar into the heart of the town to call others to come and see Christ. Jesus' merciful presence transforms the Samaritan woman's identity and her desire and restores her relationship with her own humanity, her own narrative about who she is and who she can be, and her relationship with her community. Throughout our tradition, the lives of the saints are portraits or icons of Christ's mercy and presence in ways that transform nearby life. One of the most striking images of a devoted relationship to nearby life that brings time and eternity together is the story of St. Kevin, a 13th century saint, and the Blackbird, told here by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. And then there was St. Kevin and the Blackbird. The saint is kneeling, arms stretched out inside his cell. But the cell is narrow, so one turned up palm is out the window, stiff as a crossbeam, when a blackbird lands and lays in it and settles down to nest. Kevin feels the warm eggs, the small breast, the tucked, neat head and claws, and finding himself linked into the network of eternal life, is moved to pity. Now he must hold his hand like a branch out in the sun and rain for weeks, until the young are hatched and fledged and flown. And since the whole thing is imagined anyhow, imagine being Kevin. Which is he? Self-forgetful or in agony all the time? From the neck on out down through his hurting forearms. Are his fingers sleeping? Does he still feel his knees? Or has the shut-eyed blank of under-earth crept up through him? Is there distance in his head? Alone and mirrored clear in love's deep river, to labor and not to seek reward, he prays. a prayer his body makes entirely, for he has forgotten self, forgotten bird, and on the riverbank, forgotten the river's name. A beautiful depiction of how St. Kevin's routine prayer posture becomes a home and a place of birth, not just of a baby blackbird, but of St. Kevin's own self-dissolution into pure love. As we begin to consider practically what mercy and presence look like in our lives and how we can create, or not, the conditions for mercy and presence for others, I'm struck that St. Kevin was present and held his posture long enough for the blackbird to land and settle and nest. Do we hold the right postures long enough for the proverbial blackbird to land and settle and nestle in our hand? St. Kevin didn't recoil in fear, but had the courage to maintain his posture and the curiosity to wait to see what was to come. Do we recoil in fear at the touch of something or someone that may cost us? Or do we take courage and remain curious and patient for it to reveal itself to us? In time, St. Kevin gave way to the bird and its will, adapting his hand into a safe and sturdy home. He sacrificed his own comfort and reoriented his body for the life of the blackbird. How accessible and willing are we to reorient and adapt our very bodies and beings to accommodate the extended and costly needs of others? A less dramatic but no less authentic example of real presence and mercy to nearby life can be found in the 20th century cultural television icon, Mr. Rogers, who's been remembered in the news again recently, you may have seen, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood last month. Mr. Rogers modeled a quiet and courageous devotion to the nearby life of children and adults that still resonates with us today. In his show, he addressed pressing issues and fears, like getting your hair cut, the fear of going down the bathtub drain, going to daycare, starting school, divorce, friendship, anger, silence, sibling rivalry, competition, work, war, music, death, that emotions are mentionable and manageable, and the importance of make-believe and wonder for everyday things. He talked about real life, and in doing so, he drew children and adults out of their hideouts and into the neighborhood. He believed in honest communication and often said that there's more drama in two people talking honestly through a conflict than in a violent movie scene. He looked through the camera to his television neighbors at home, addressed them directly, and introduced them to his friends throughout his show. He sang the opening song, "It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood," live, each episode, accompanied by a live piano, so we could hear his real voice that day. His show was known for its slow pacing to mimic the pace of real and meaningful human interaction. Long camera shots, including transitions of him walking from the living room to the kitchen, stopping to feed and talk to the fish, with no quick cuts or edits. The in-between was essential. Others try to pack in as much as possible, but Mr. Rogers knew that the space in his segments was just as important as the words he spoke. He described his work as a meaningful neighborhood expression of care. And his authentic presence was not simply a character he played on his show, but the kind of presence and mercy he practiced and cultivated in real life. So I'd like to just show you a brief video of Mr. Rogers singing to Joan Rivers on The Tonight Show some years ago. I know that it's dated, but I think that his example of merciful presence is perhaps even more poignant now than it was in 1983. As you watch, I just ask you to pay attention to what Mr. Rogers and Joan Rivers do throughout their interaction. The clip we're going to watch is about 2 minutes long.
You write all your own songs, don't you? Everything?
I write the songs, and John Costa is our musical director who plays them so well.
Do the song. The one that Melissa likes, I Like You.
Oh, good.
I remember that from when she was
Well,
growing
I'll
up.
sing that to you and
No,
everybody
don't you?
else
You'll
here.
make me die.
It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. But it's you I like. The way you are right now. The way down deep inside you. Not the things that hide you. Not your jokes. They're just beside you. But it's you I like. Every part of you. Your skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new. I hope that you'll remember, even when you're feeling blue, that it's you I like, it's you yourself, it's you, it's you I like.
Has anybody else ever tried to record that? Some of your songs, that would be a great song for something like a Sinatra. Has anyone else ever tried to record your songs?
They're welcome to do it.
Yeah, because wouldn't that be a good song for somebody else? Not that you...
So what does he do in that exchange? Eye contact. He sings to her personally. As you mentioned, he looks directly at her. He seemed very calm, kind of comfortable in his own skin, even as she wasn't. He sang to her as a person, not a persona, and we know Joan Rivers was quite a persona. He changed the lyrics for the song, just for her. Not your jokes, they're just beside you. Typically he would sing, not your toys, they're just beside you, for his other younger audiences. And what did you notice that she did in the interaction? Yeah, the most obvious one, when she kind of covered herself in the middle of it. At the beginning, she, much like us, she initially invites him to sing. And then when he says, yes, I'll sing actually to you, she says, no, don't sing to me. You'll make me die, were her words. And so she takes it in when he sings. When he sings every part of you, your skin, your eyes, your feelings, that's when she hides herself in the sweater that he gave her. And then at the end, she thanks him, but you'll notice that she kind of quickly deflects as well. So has anyone else recorded your songs? He's like, what? You know, like Sinatra, somebody else, you know. The reason that I share that exchange, I think it highlights that it's difficult to give and receive authentic presence and love. I know so much of this must seem so obvious to you. But in the work that I do with a variety of people at a variety of ages, I find this estrangement from our humanity everywhere. We're more accustomed these days to cruel, often anonymous honesty online on the one hand, and empty platitudes and meaningless likes on the other. It's quite rare, I think, to find someone who loves us enough to have the hard conversation without being cruel or showering us with false praise. Someone who loves us enough to know and draw us lovingly forward like Jesus does with the Samaritan woman at the well. Just this semester, several of the students that the staff in Echo and I work with, we've kind of seen this, this pattern of hiding. One recently, just last week, who was avoiding our emails and calls and not making deadlines. And finally, when I was able to speak to him, I said, "What's going on?" And he just said, "I hide. I hide when things get hard. And he said, my family hides. It's what we do. We do it really well. And of course I said, I understand. But you're at a point in your life now where you get to decide, do you want to keep hiding? Or do you want to learn to show up to your life? He said, no one's cared enough to tell me that, to ask me that question. Of course I want to show up to my life, but I don't know how. I said, well, we can figure that out. But the will to do it and not to hide is important. Mr. Rogers is highly regarded, but also considered childish or silly by some, or maybe even some part of us here, which I think is more an indictment of us than of him. The embarrassing truth Fred Rogers witnesses to is that we all have the desire to be known and loved for being ourselves, but we're tempted to earn love and admiration from other people, from ourselves, of God. Knowing that we can be loved exactly as we are, Fred Rogers said, gives us all the best opportunity for growing into healthy, holy people. When he was asked about the most important things adults can do for young people, he said, be one more honest adult in their lives. Receive gracefully. Not like Joan Rivers and myself were deflecting. And continue to grow ourselves. In the spirit of Mr. Rogers and the truth he witnessed to, I'd like you to take the next 10 seconds to think of someone who's been an honest adult to you. Someone who's helped you become who you are inside today. And I'll keep the time. Imagine the poverty if we asked our young people and they had no one come to mind. Jess and I would like to finish up our time just by sharing some practical best practices to kind of get our minds churning in that direction. And then we'll have plenty of time for your insights and comments and questions as well. So we've talked about the importance of paying attention to the body. Someone who works with our students and has helped us a lot in this arena also recognized the deep anxiety that many young people feel. And just has a very simple practice of asking us to find our feet. It's very difficult to find your feet and be somewhere else at the same time. So try it. In your own mind's eye, find your feet. And then we invite our students to allow whatever is emerging to emerge and to practice holding it and breathing through it. They find that most of the things that are creating anxiety throughout the day can be dissolved in doing that throughout the day. There are other things that, of course, that need much deeper and longer attention, but so much is that maintenance. So doing what Fred Rogers said, which is emotions are mentionable and they're manageable. The other is attending to the body in terms of the events that we have. So we put on a lot of retreats within our programs, and of course you're really always focused on content and what is it that we're sharing, what's the information that we're imparting or inviting them into. Of course that's important, but when we finish writing a schedule for our retreats or whatever event it is, we consciously walk through it and say, what is the body doing at every moment? Because we'll find that while we're engaging them in a variety of different kind of content, the body is sitting often that whole time. So just being attentive to what is it that we're asking the body to do at any given time.
And attentiveness to the body is disruptive. We have several colleagues, too, who have or are going to have children shortly. And we wouldn't imagine birth without a baby. And yet, so to be the morbid one again, we imagine death without a body. Because these are moments of inbreaking, of disruption. And so to allow ourselves to learn to be disrupted, to allow our schedules to be disrupted, to be attentive to the bodies, the presence of others in those ways is challenging. St. Ignatius, in his guidelines for making an election, a choice, the third one is to imagine yourself on your deathbed. And to imagine, would this be the choice you would want to make, or would you regret it? And so I think orienting our lives toward that vision, toward that eschatological vision, can be really critical in allowing the end, that telos that we are made for, to break into the here and now, so that the eternal and the things of time can really cooperate with each other.
The second is just, practicing the art of conversation. Again, something that we all probably think that we're pretty good at. But I don't know about you, but when I walk across campus or I walk in any city or town that I'm in, it used to be much easier to make eye contact and say hello to people as they passed by. That's much harder now, because I'm either buried in my phone or I don't want to disturb someone else who is. But I encourage us to practice saying hello. And another thing that one of my friends has taken up lately, she says she goes 5 rounds of conversation with a stranger. So not just the one round of hello, that's fine, but she was in the dressing room after swimming recently, and so she said hi, hello, to another person there. Usually she would leave it there, but she said, "Pool's cold today." And the woman said, "Yeah, it was." And she said, "I wonder why." They said, "Oh, the maintenance guy's not here, so I bet no one is watching it, watching the temperature." "Oh, where is he?" "Well, he's in the hospital. He's had a return of cancer. There's a card to sign for him at the front desk." And my friend said, "Oh, thank you. I'll sign it. Sure thing." 5 rounds of conversation. And look at all the information that she got, and she was able to connect. Very simple. And also, I think, with those that we know a little bit better, having the courage to ask what Simone Weil calls the most important question we can ask our neighbor. What are you going through?
And asking that question, what are you going through, requires a disposition that is willing to listen. That deep listening. Stanley Hauerwas at a conference about reintegrating veterans from war talks about that deep listening, that the church can be a place of that deep listening. And there are so many wounds to attend to. What is that deep listening that we do? That is a hospitable listening that allows people to tell us truly what they are going through in all of its complexity and messiness.
The third area that we just wanted to mention is model healthy engagement of conflict. My older sister and I used to fight when we were teenagers, and instead of isolating us and sending us to our rooms, we shared one, so that wouldn't have been very effective. But instead of doing that, he placed 2 chairs quite close together facing each other, and he made us sit down, and he said, "You can't get up until you'll talk to one another respectfully and mean it." And it was amazing the contortions that we would throw our bodies into to not touch one another and not have to look at one another. But just feeling the presence of her body there in the chair across from me, over time, melted my posture. And of course, we almost always got up from the chair as friends, and now my dad was the enemy. So it worked on some level, it didn't on another. But there's something about facing other people. Brene Brown who's a popular sociologist and writer, talks about an experience with one of her colleagues. She was running a meeting, and she said, oh, item number 4, we're going to take that off of today's agenda, and moved on to item number 5. And item number 4 was his agenda item. And so he piped up a little later and raised his hand and said, you know, the story I'm telling myself is that you took agenda item number 4 off of the agenda because it's not important. And I'm not really following anything else you're saying because I'm stuck there. And she said, I'm so glad that you said that, because the reason I took it off the agenda was because it's so important, it needs its own meeting. So the importance of naming the stories we tell ourselves. What's my story? What's your story? What's our story? It's amazing how different those can be and how quickly they can be resolved when we simply name them. The final is creating spaces that are hospitable to mercy and presence. You know, sometimes we talk about spiritual retreats as places where people leave kind of whatever's burdening them at the door. And certainly we all need those kinds of retreats where we do leave those things at the door. But why would we leave at the door the things that are in most need of transformation? But when we are in charge of these events, I think it's really helpful to recognize that people are coming with a lot, and to give them time at the beginning to do kind of an inventory of what they're coming in with. What is it that needs to be set aside, but also what is it that needs to kind of come through the door with them?
And I think we need to think about the home. This is, I think, really obvious to all of us as the primary space where formation for mercy and presence occurs. In very small gestures, in checking in doing highs and lows, in which the parent might be the low of the day for the teenager, to dedicating time to moving in the house in silence. You become very aware of your body and the bodies of others in a particular way when you are together in silence.
Those are really, I mean, you know, there's lots of ways that we could talk about presence and mercy, but as I said before, I think you all have a lot to say and maybe questions to ask, so we want to use the rest of our time together to do that. Your attention this afternoon to us, I think, has been an exercise of mercy and presence, so thank you very much for that.